So 'tis the season of temper tantrums and meltdowns, and fall being a time of great transition means that kids' behaviors are front and center because transitions are the time where kids' behaviors are most in question. So this has me wondering, as I've had multiple conversations around punishment and consequences and what do we do and how do we do it, I'm wondering, why do we think punishment is the way to handle kids' behavior when they have outbursts or temper tantrums or any disagreement with us? Whatever happened to teaching over training? That's what I'm wondering today. So as always, I like to start with a little story time, and this one's going to go way, way back to when I was in college. I was lucky enough to be taught in my education program behavior management from the son-in-law of B.F. Skinner. His B.F. Skinner's daughter, Julie, worked at my university, and her husband, I think his name was Ernesto Vargas. Isn't that a great name? He was my professor of behavior management, is what the classroom was called. And if you don't know who B.F. Skinner is, he is a psychologist who invented the study of behaviorism. He's famous for something called operant conditioning, which if you've ever heard of Skinner boxes in your Psych 101 class, or, maybe in high school when you were taking AP Psych, it's on its most basic level. Skinner boxes and operant conditioning was used to train, mice, other animals to respond to stimuli, to therefore then train their behaviors. So if you wanted them to do a certain thing, you stimulated or you had a response in a certain way. And he kind of tried to prove that that's how we all sort of grow and adapt, is through these environmental or otherwise stimulus and response things that shape our behaviors. It's not a bad theory. You can have positive or negative reinforcement. And this is where I always got confused as a college student, because negative reinforcement isn't exactly what it sounds like. It's not necessarily punishment. Negative reinforcement is the removal of a stimulus rather than the presenting of one. If you think of in a classroom, if my students turn in their homework Monday through Thursday, then Friday I removed homework from their day. They earned this thing that I took away. Actually, it was a negative thing that I took away. The most basic example of negative reinforcement is an alarm clock, because you smack that button or you hit your phone now and that annoying sound goes away. It's sometimes why alarm clocks that don't have an annoying sound don't work. The thing is, you could talk about positive reinforcement, which is just what it sounds like. You reward good behavior. If you think of sticker charts in schools, if I stay in my seat, or dog treats, if you're walking a dog and you continue to give them little treats every time they don't bark at somebody or every time they follow closely to you. A positive reinforcement is something that you get because you've just done the thing we want you to do. And the thing about all of it, positive reinforcements, negative reinforcements, operant conditioning, is that they're all sensible. They're all logical. Obviously, the theory has lasted this long that people are teaching about it and using it. And there's whole professionals that are trained in behavioral analysis and behavioral conditioning. And so I'm not here to dispel any of that. I'm not here to question my professors or question their father or father-in-law, but I am saying that for me, sometimes it was really confusing in practice. Again, I was all in college. I thought my professor was wildly intelligent, and these seemed like such easy sort of for the math part of my brain. I loved the idea of like, if you do this, then this happens. If you don't do this, then this happens. If someone does this and you take this away, then they'll stop doing this. Like, that's a beautiful thing, right? I loved that concept. And so I was all in on behavior modification, and I was fully prepared to lay down all the B.F. Skinner tactics that I could in my first job as a teacher. And that lasted about, I think a week might be generous. My enthusiasm for behavior management, the B.F. Skinner way, lasted maybe 24 hours before it all blew up into my face. Because it turns out that theories can be excellent in a lab with mice and wonderful closed conditions. But those same things maybe aren't so perfect in practice when you have a classroom of 27 kids, especially if some of those kids don't speak the language or just arrived in the country days prior, or come to you with any kind of history or baggage or trauma, or just other ideas of how one is supposed to behave. Life isn't neat, and classrooms and homes aren't as orderly as science labs. So we can't control for all the factors that might come into play when it comes to behavior. And that makes it much more difficult to just reinforce or just punish so simply all the time. Somewhere along the way, I think that summer, I was reintroduced to the idea of teaching versus managing. In that first year of my classroom, I was literally just trying to survive. I was trying to keep the kids alive. I was trying to keep myself alive. I was trying to get through this thing that I thought had been a dream of mine and turned out to feel like a real nightmare. But then that summer, I got to go to a training, a professional development opportunity where, I don't know why. It's not like my classroom was total chaos, but for some reason, my principal thought it would be a good idea if I go to it. It not only changed the way that I taught, like almost from the minute I entered the training, but it really heavily influenced the way that I would parent going forward. It was a class that not only used teaching instead of operant conditioning as a behavior tool, but it also took this 360-degree view of both the adults and the children in the classroom. It taught me that I needed to incorporate some self-care, that I needed to look at myself and ask, why am I reacting the way that I'm reacting to this? I needed to consider myself in the equation, and I needed to consider the students in a way that was caring of them and their whole self, not just conditioning their behaviors. I learned to create spaces that promoted good behavior rather than punished bad behavior. I learned that not all behavior that's labeled good or bad is either one of those things. I learned that kids act as a way of communicating. So it was my job then to figure out what their behaviors were trying to say. And perhaps most importantly from that training, I learned that training a kid through punishment or negatively reinforcing or even positively reinforcing a specific behavior was sometimes an effective short-term solution, and that never really helped in the long term. Instead, what I learned was a more effective way would to be create environments and show up with an attitude that helped not only foster mutual respect and understanding, but to make room for the kids and, quite frankly, the adults to grow into the best version of themselves. I taught my students how to be themselves in the world instead of training my students how to behave. And that translated into how I ran my household as well. Not all the time. Please do not mistake me for perfect. I'm sure my children have plenty of stories about me messing it up. But even though I'm human, I tried to mostly teach my kids rather than train them. They're not dogs. I can't just give them treats every single time I want them to do something. And as much as they accused me of replacing them with dogs when they went away to college, I did recognize the difference between them early on. So I parented in a way that fit that belief that children are to be taught, not trained. They're just little tiny adults that are learning how to be adults. They're not these amorphous blobs of clay that we get to shape and we get to mold and we get to change. They're fully formed humans that we have to help guide along a way that helps them grow into who they're supposed to be. It's not a style. It's not from a book. It's not called gentle parenting or attached parenting or any other buzzword that's currently in your social media feeds. This is just simply the way I did it and the way that I help others do it now in my office. And ultimately what it boils down to is knowing yourself and staying curious with your kids and yourself so that you can learn who they are and you can get to know yourself better so you know what both of you need to help them grow. There are 3 keys to this. And in my book, Explicit Parenting, I talk about 4 things, and one of them is kind of 2. But these are not the 4 pillars of explicit parenting. These are just the 3 keys to be able to parent in a way that's teaching, not training. And it starts with grace. And that's such a sort of nebulous concept. But what I mean by it is that you need to give yourself some grace and some softness. And you need to give your kids that same grace and softness. And you probably need to give your parents that same grace and softness too, in some way. What it looks like for yourself is giving yourself the space to learn your own triggers. I talked about in the classroom how I had to understand why I was reacting a certain way to things. It's equally, if not more important to do as a parent. What are your triggers? What are your expectations? Not just for you, but for the kid and for your relationship with one another. And what are your hopes and goals for your family and for yourself. Giving yourself grace is giving yourself the space to figure all that stuff out in a non-judgmental way. We don't do that very much for ourselves. We're often in a position where we're critiquing everything we do. It's really not helpful. I'm not saying don't check in and make sure you're on the right track, but I'm saying the judgment, it's unnecessary. We don't need to be punished for the way that we've done things in the past. And we don't need to be afraid that we're ruining our kids with every decision that we make. We're learning. They're learning. And as long as they know that we care about that, that's the important part. That's what matters. We need to know how we feel. We need to know what we need. And we need to know how we want to show up in order for us to be the teacher for our kids. Maybe we've never been taught, or maybe we've only been taught the exact wrong way. And the only thing we know is that we don't want to repeat it. We need to reconcile all of that stuff so that we can move forward. That kind of moves into the grace for our parents. And I'm not suggesting that you need to forgive and forget and move on. What I'm suggesting is that parents are human too. And that may mean a variety of things. That may mean they had their own mental health struggles. That may mean they had no support. That may mean they didn't know any better. And if we stay stuck in the shame of it or the blame of it, and sometimes even the denial of it because we're afraid that we might shame or blame, if we stay stuck there, then we can't move on at all. So accepting the people who raised us for exactly as they are and what they had and what that did to us, it's necessary for our own sense of self. Again, we don't need to forgive and forget everything. We don't need to excuse anything. But if we can look realistically at it and accept it for what it was, then we can move forward in a way that suits our families best. And then grace for our kids just means that you need to remember the tiny, innocent little ones that you once held. Think of their little tiny hands in your hands. Think of their sticky smiles. Think of the things that are sweet and innocent and cute, even when they are the opposite version right in front of you. Even when they are the raging, red-faced kid or the obstinate toddler or the chaotic, emotionally all over the place teens. Maybe especially when they're those things, we need to remember that inside that wild shell is that sweet and innocent and nearly perfect little person that we brought into our families. They call them growing pains for a reason. Sometimes growing is ugly. And it's on us to remember that what we see isn't always indicative of who they are. That leads to number 2, which is curiosity. It is nearly impossible to be judgmental if you stay curious. If you genuinely approach things with wonder about why things are happening, and you approach behaviors as wondering what they're communicating, it's easier to imagine them as just that, communication, behaviors, a moment in time, rather than some deep character flaw, yours or theirs. Then, if you can do that, the grace part comes a lot easier. Staying curious was the key to me not throttling my kids when they argued with me or screaming right back in their little faces when they screamed in mine as toddlers. It kept me from yanking them by the arm and dragging them out of a place most of the time. Again, I'm not perfect. And I'm sure each one of my kids has a story or two to tell about a time I got it completely wrong. I know there were moments where I dragged them by the arm out of a store. I know there were times where I got right in their little faces. Might not have screamed, but I'm sure I didn't look nice. I know I did it wrong so often, but that's when the grace kicks in, because I hope that my kids also have stories to tell about me apologizing, about me owning my own bad behavior, about me owning my mistakes, and about me being able to try to rebuild with them in a way that we both grew out of it. I hope they have those stories too. And I think they do, because I can also remember a lot of those times as well. The rebuilding part, the apology part, it's key to your relationship. It's key to their growth, and it's key to your own self-worth. It also leads to the third key of this whole parenting process, which is grit. I'm about to curse, so cover your ears if you're a little one. This parenting shit ain't easy. It never has been, but it does seem now like we're just more in it than anybody before us has ever been. We're worried about their emotional well-being. We're worried about their physical well-being. We're worried about guns in schools. We're worried about, are we saying or doing the right thing? If we have girls or boys, we're worried about if we're giving them eating disorders. We worry about if we're not feeding them enough. We worry about, there's so many things that we worry that we're messing up. It makes the job 1,000 times harder than it already is naturally. So you're going to want to do the right thing all the time, and you're going to do the wrong thing a lot of the time. And that's the part that takes grit. It takes grit to make the repairs when you mess it up. And it also takes grit to do the right thing sometimes, because the right thing might feel impossible. Rewind back to the part about the kid screaming in my face. It's really hard to not scream back. It takes some grit. It takes digging in and finding your sense of calm and self to not go right back at them. We can know what's right and not feel it. Grit is the difference. Grit is the part that has us strong enough to be able to connect what we know and what we feel, to do the impossible, to repair when we mess it up, to walk to our children in humility and say, I'm just a human doing my best. And the important part is I love you endlessly. The key to that perseverance is to know that you're going to reap the rewards with a healthy, mutually satisfying adult relationship with your kids. I won't guarantee it, but you might even have a drama-free set of teen years. Again, I'm not perfect, and neither are my kids, and neither is our household. But man, it's real, real good. I mentioned in my professional development class, taking a 360-degree approach to teachers and students. That same thing needs to be applied at home. And what that means, and this is always the hardest part for people to hear, because they don't want to do it, because they feel bad about it, or because they don't know how. There's not enough time. How am I going to do all the things I need to do and take care of myself? But doing this well means carving out time for yourself and your own care. There's nothing selfish about taking care of yourself. And I am the first person to tell you that it is not easy to do, and the world is not designed to help us do it. So let's just get that off the table right away. Don't feel any guilt that you're not doing it. Don't feel any shame that you haven't done it. The world doesn't make it easy to do. And I feel like I shouldn't have to remind anyone this anymore, but alas, here we are. I know people still feel guilty. They still feel like they're doing it wrong. They still feel like they shouldn't be able to enjoy anything. But you don't have to wait 18 years to have a hot cup of coffee. Make time for you so that you have more to give to them. You deserve it. You've earned it. And girls and boys, you need it. So that last part, I didn't mention it as a key, but self-care and self-realization might be the first thing you need in order to parent well. So whether you're in a classroom or a living room, you're the teacher. And it's your job to help kids understand how to behave, because it's a developmental stage, not because they're scared of you and not because they might get punished, but because you want them to grow into their version of the best them. You want them to get along in the world. You want them to have fun. You want them to enjoy their life. And that's always easier when you're not throwing a temper tantrum or not feeling the need to scream in your parents' face. No one wants to do those things. No kid wants to behave in a way that triggers their parents or makes their parent angry. They're trying to tell us something. They're trying to work something out. They're trying to change it or grow through it. And it's our job to take care of ourselves so that we can show up in a way they need to assist them in that growth. All right. That's all I got today, parents. Stay tuned, because we're going to do a couple more episodes like this about punishment versus consequences versus growth versus teaching, all of those things. I can't wait to wonder with you.